And welcome to the Understanding ASD session 2, Anxiety and ASD. This session is hosted by the Sheffield Adult Autism and Neurodevelopmental Service, and my name is Jonathan. I am an assistant psychologist, and I will be guiding you through today's session. So today we will do a brief recap of the first session, and then we'll move on to the main presentation, which is all around anxiety, what it is, and how you can cope with it. And we will finish on a summary, conclusion, and talk about what to expect at the next session. So last week we did an introduction to the course and to autism. We discussed the ASD pentad. So this is the model where there are 5 main difficulties that all autistic people tend to have in order for them to get a diagnosis. So to recap these, there is social interaction, social communication, flexibility of thought, sensory sensitivities, and emotion regulation. We also discussed what might help deal with these difficulties. So what things you can put in place to cope or thrive. We discussed having structure and predictability in your life, having a familiarity and therefore feeling safe. Sensory activities, different forms of clear communication, favoured topics of conversation, as well as engaging in favoured activities. And we discussed a life in balance. So how to cope in a neurotypically biased world, where you will be doing activities that are quite stressful and also have your own coping strategies for dealing with these different activities. So I hope you found the first session useful. And today's session, we're going to be focusing on anxiety, and specifically how anxiety might affect someone with autism. So just before we begin, it's just really important to remember that everyone experiences anxiety at some point in their lives, and anxiety does affect people in different ways and to different degrees. So the coping strategies that might work for one particular individual doesn't always work for others. For some people, they can learn to manage anxiety without any professional help. But for others, it is more of a chronic condition that needs specialist input. So let's start back at the basics then. So what is anxiety? So anxiety is essentially the body's alarm and survival mechanism. And this is called the fight or flight response. So as we have evolved from potentially living a life where there were quite a lot of threats around to the modern day world where we are not receiving any threats against our safety on a daily basis. The mechanism for flight or flight was there to help us either fight a particular threat or flight, so run away from it. And that mechanism is in pretty much all animals and birds and fish, as well as humans. But as I said, in this modern day, we're not often coming up against many threats. However, this fight or flight response is still ingrained within us. And sometimes this means it kicks in when it's not really needed, So for example, potentially doing public speaking can cause a fight or flight response and cause people to feel very, very anxious and potentially avoid the situation. And anxiety can also trigger a scanning mode where you might be on the lookout for danger, become really hyper alert, and therefore increase the likelihood of this system being activated. Anxiety is a normal emotion, however. It does help us cope with difficult, challenging, or dangerous situations. And it is really, really common. I think everyone struggles with anxiety from time to time. Sometimes it's a lot more regular. But there are times where everyone will feel worried, anxious, uptight, or stressed. But anxiety becomes a problem when it actually stops you from enjoying normal life. It affects your work, your family relationships, your friendships, your social life, and potentially your hobbies too. So this is when anxiety takes over and things can start to feel quite overwhelming. So how common is anxiety? So anxiety is one of the most common mental health problems in the UK and elsewhere. However, anxiety also seems to be a lot more common amongst individuals who are autistic. So why is this? There's no specific reasons. As I said, everyone is different and individual. But these are just some suggestions as to why that might be the case. So first of all is a tendency to get stuck on certain ways of thinking. So as we spoke about in the first session under flexibility of thought, black and white thinking often means someone might think things are either right or wrong. And therefore, if you have a very black and white thinking process, it means that understanding those grey areas can be really, really difficult. And then that can cause quite a lot of anxiety. People on the autistic spectrum also have difficulties with change, facing unpredictability, potentially transitions, so moving from junior school up to secondary school or moving into a new job can be really, really stressful and anxiety provoking. As well as a whole host of social situations where you might not really understand social rules and struggle to communicate with people you might not know very well. And then there's also communication and language difficulties. So sometimes struggling to communicate because you might not understand facial expressions, certain language, body language, for example, not really understanding irony and jokes can cause an autistic person to feel really, really anxious when they are having conversations with other people. Certain types of sensory difficulties can cause quite a lot of anxiety. So for example, really loud sudden noises, busy environments where there's quite a lot going on, quite a lot of visual stimuli can be really, really stressful. But also having difficulty understanding and reading emotions means that people on the autistic spectrum might find it really difficult to actually recognize the signs of anxiety that their body is telling them. So what does increase the risk of anxiety amongst the autistic population? So growing up with an awareness that you might be different to those around you, even family members and friends, and being told that you're coming across as different. And that can all lead to a very high trait anxiety. There could also be things like family tension, experiencing bullying and being victimized, as well as having adverse life events. So events that might happen in your life that are really, really difficult. So let's talk through an example of the signs of anxiety that you might experience. So imagine the event is going to the bus stop to catch a bus into town. You might not do this very regularly, and therefore you might feel quite anxious and worried about doing so. The first thing you might notice are the physical sensations. So you might have a racing heart. That might lead you to feeling quite breathless, and then lead you to feeling dizzy. And if you're physically feeling quite anxious, that might develop into thoughts such as, I'm going to make a fool of myself, or I don't know what I'm doing. Other people are going to notice that I'm panicking. And if you've got all these physical sensations and all these negative thoughts going around your head, it can often lead to certain avoidant behaviours, such as no longer going to the bus stop, not being able to take yourself into town or wherever you need to go, and potentially spending quite a lot of time at home. And once you get home, the physical sensations tend to slow down, you start to feel a little bit better, and you find yourself trapped in this cycle of avoidance, anxious bodily physical sensations, and negative thoughts. So what about the psychological signs? So if you experience a lot of anxiety, you might notice that you quite easily lose your patience with other people. You might have difficulty concentrating. You might be thinking constantly about the worst outcome, especially if you're worried about something. Those worries can often domino. You might have difficulty sleeping. And a lot of anxiety is also really common with having a low mood or being depressed. You might also become really preoccupied with a certain subject, for example, a particular worry you might be having. And that brings us on to worrying thoughts. So if you're feeling very, very anxious, you might notice that you're worrying quite a lot about maybe things that could happen in the future. So some examples of these worries might be, people will see that I'm different or can't cope. I'll embarrass myself. I will lose control. Or something awful will happen if I don't do something. And living in a state of anxiety means that these thoughts are probably going to be going around your head quite regularly. And if you're having worrying thoughts, you might stop wanting to go out into the world and interact with other people. The physical symptoms of anxiety are very different from person to person, but generally they might include having a headache, having that churning feeling in your stomach, feeling quite nauseous, potentially even having diarrhea, having heart palpitations, so your heart beating really fast or even skipping a beat. You might have backache, muscle tension, trembling, numbness or tingling in your arms, hands or legs, and potentially even sweating or flushing, so going red. And then just some more that tend to happen when the fight or flight response kicks in. So a shortness of breath, tight chest, dizziness, maybe wanting to go to the toilet, shaking, having a dry mouth or feeling really, really thirsty, struggling to swallow, having a blurred vision, or having butterflies and feeling sick. And then these result in certain behaviours. So you might notice avoiding people or going out to places or just not going out at all. Or maybe only going to certain places at certain times. So for example, if you need to go to the local supermarket and do a food shop, you might go to maybe a smaller one, or you might go at less busy times, such as quite late at night or very early in the morning. Potentially only going out if you're accompanied by someone else. Or if you're able to go out but you're feeling very anxious, finding a way to escape or leave that place early. So I think now might be a good time to pause for an exercise. So what I'd like you to do is take the time to consider the following questions and answer them on page 17 in your workbook. So what situations make you specifically feel anxious? What are your own symptoms of anxiety? So what do you do with your behaviour? How does your body react? Or how do you think or feel? So if you could take the next 5 to 10 minutes and pause this video to complete this exercise. Now it might be really useful to think about what can help you. So essentially building yourself a toolbox of different strategies you can use to help cope with your anxiety. And it could be useful to think about things you already do. So firstly, physical activity. So there might be things such as traditional exercise, so doing sports, going for a walk, going to the gym, cycling, and running. As well as more creative activities. And this could be dancing, gymnastics, art, martial arts, and gardening, for example. And then there's also physical activity that is very sensory soothing. So doing yoga, doing some crafts, drawing or painting, or using particular sensory equipment. And physical activity is really good at combating anxiety because when you feel really anxious, you have a build-up of all this tension inside your body and quite a lot of stored energy. So doing physical activity can help exert that energy and stop you from feeling as anxious. And then there's also social activities. So spending time with the family or friends, spending time socializing, particularly around your interests. And if you feel quite anxious about speaking with other people or meeting new people, try to use less stressful forms of communication, such as texting or chatting. But also remember to balance socializing with spending some time alone. And often people who are autistic really enjoy spending a bit of time alone and it helps refresh them. And finally, if you're an animal lover, spending time with pets can really help calm the anxiety. And as we've mentioned a few times before, creating predictability. So potentially putting up visual schedules, visual cues and symbols, developing routines, but also learning more about your own individual signs of anxiety. And if you're able to identify maybe those first initial signs, you might be able to calm yourself down in enough time to stop that cycling from continue and from any physical signs developing into psychological or behavioural signs. Another really good way of managing your anxiety is to do relaxation techniques. So, for example, slow breathing techniques, where you just spend time focusing on your breath by closing your eyes and breathing in deeply for about 5 seconds, and then releasing that breath really slowly over 10 seconds. And breathing techniques are really, really useful because one physical sign of anxiety is really quick and shallow breaths. And if you find yourself doing that, what's happening is that you're bringing quite a lot of oxygen into the body and up to the brain. And that can cause you to feel quite overwhelmed and anxious. So being able to really slow down your breath can just restore balance to the levels inside your body and brain. Another technique is visualization. And this is where you imagine a really calm or peaceful setting. And if you are imagining that you are there, you can almost trick your body into feeling that you're in a calm and relaxing place. So for example, thinking about going for a walk in the woods or spending some time on a beach. Now, depending on the way that your mind works, you might find that you're quite a creative thinker and you're really good at visualizing things. But some people on the autistic spectrum really, really struggle with their imagination and visualization. So this is a very individual task, and it really depends on the way that you like to think. And there will be some guided visualization strategies that you can find on the internet. Another one is making sure that you're regularly engaging with hobbies. Hobbies are very individual and they're something that you would really enjoy doing. And if you're enjoying doing something, then it's either good at distracting away from anxiety or just giving you those happy and positive endorphins. Listening to music can be really, really calming, whether that's classical music, something instrumental, maybe your favorite songs, whether that's pop music or rock music. And sometimes it might not be just music. It might be white noise or the sound of rain or the sound of waves crashing against the beach. I'd advise you to try out listening to different music and different sounds to see if that helps with your anxiety. Another one will be sensory soothing activities. So doing things that are going to really highlight and make your senses come alive. So be that eating particular meals, smelling particular smells, or even certain fabrics can help calm people down. And finally, mindfulness. So mindfulness is a relatively new strategy in psychology, but it has been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And mindfulness is the practice of being in the moment. Modern world can be really fast-paced and really busy, and often people will do multiple things at once without really slowing down and really understanding what they're doing. So mindfulness is a great way for you to distract yourself from your anxiety and really focus on one particular task at a time. So what we're going to do is give mindfulness a go now. And we're going to do an exercise called the 5 senses. So I'm going to read a script out to you, and I'd like you to join in the exercise along with me. So we're going to start with the 5 senses grounding technique. And I'm going to ask you to look around you, wherever you are. Notice the colours in the room that you're in. Notice the different textures of the furniture. Notice the shapes of things. And notice the light coming in. And next, I'd like you to listen to and really notice any sounds that might be around you. You might hear traffic, people's voices, the washing machine, music playing, or the TV in another room. So really listen to what is around you. And now I'd like you to notice your body. So the boundary of your skin, how your clothes feel on your skin. Feel the chair that you're sitting in. Feel the floor against your feet. And now that you're starting to feel a bit more in touch with your senses, we're going to start the 5 senses exercise. So first of all, I'd like you to use your sight. And I want you to look around the room and think about 5 different things that you can see. And I want you to really notice each thing at a time. Notice the way that it looks, and notice the colour. And now I'd like you to notice 4 different things that you can hear. And now 3 different things that you can touch. And I'd like you to touch them and really feel their texture and the shape. And now I'd like you to try and focus on 2 different things that you can smell, or maybe get something that you like the smell of. And just spend a small amount of time really taking in that scent. And then I'd like you to think of one thing you could taste, whether it's the last thing that you ate or drank, or potentially brushing your teeth. And now I'd like you to take one slow and deep breath. And that was the 5 senses exercise. I hope that you enjoyed it. It's a really good exercise that you can use almost wherever you are. And it's good at distracting you if you're feeling very anxious or low in mood. And I would encourage you to practice this on a regular basis. And if you'd like any additional information on anxiety or any other mental health problems, I'd like you to visit the National Autistic Society's website, which is www.autism.org.uk. And there's a section there on anxiety. There are also several different books out specifically around autism spectrum disorder and mental health. And one example is Overcoming Anxiety and Depression on the Autism Spectrum by L. Wilkinson. And finally, if you are a local to Sheffield, you can access the Sheffield IAPT service, which is called Increasing Access to Psychological Therapies. And this is an NHS service for people with common mental health difficulties, so more specifically around anxiety and depression. You can self-refer to the IAPT service by visiting their website, which is www.iaptsheffield.shsc.nhs.uk, or you might be able to find the service through your GP surgery. The IAPT service looks at cognitive behavioural therapy for helping people cope with their mental health problems. So that looks at the way that you're thinking and the way that you're behaving, and tries to give you some strategies to combat the way that you might be feeling. And there are also some apps that you could download or some websites that you can access that might help with any difficulties you may have. So there's a specific autism support app called Brain in Hand, and this is linked to the National Autistic Society. There's an app called Relax Plus, and this is a free app that has guided relaxation and music. And there's also a mindfulness app called Headspace, which will give you some different guided mindfulness practices like the 5 senses that we have just gone through. And that brings us to the end of today's session. So today's session was all on anxiety, what it is, and how you might be able to cope with it. And as I mentioned at the start, everyone deals with mental health problems in different ways and has different levels of anxiety and low mood. If you are worried about your mental health in any way, I would really suggest you speaking with your GP, and therefore you'll be able to access some services to get you professional help. So thank you again for listening. And the next session, which will be session number 3, will be looking at the senses. So I'll hope to see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.